Welcome back, Golden Games family. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and join us for more awesome gaming content. Today, we're diving into something super interesting, Mast 1C0 Re. Now, what exactly is Mast 1C0 Re? Well, it's been causing a stir in the gaming community, and if you're into PlayStation or modding, you might have heard of it. So let's break it down. The Mast 1C0 Re exploit targets the backward compatibility feature of the PS4 and PS5, specifically through the PS2 emulator that these consoles use to run PS2 games. This vulnerability has been known for some time, and security researchers have found ways to exploit it to run in signed code on both consoles. Here's a breakdown of how Part 1, Escape of the Mast 1C0 Re exploit process works. Key concepts: PS2 emulator on PS4 and PS5. Both the PS4 and PS5 use an emulator to run PS2 games. Some PS2 titles are available for download through the PlayStation Store, but they use an emulator within the consoles to run these games. The exploit targets this emulator because of a vulnerability in the way it handles PS2 game data. Initial vulnerability. The Mast 1C0 Re exploit begins by using a legitimate PS2 game occage, Shadow King, which can be either from a physical disc or a digital purchase from the PlayStation Store. Some older PS2 games allowed certain data injections or code manipulation, which can lead to executing arbitrary code on modern consoles like the PS4 and PS5 through the emulator. Buffer overflow. A buffer overflow occurs when too much data is sent to a program, exceeding its capacity and allowing the attacker to overwrite parts of memory. This is a common type of vulnerability in older software, which the PS2 emulator might be susceptible to. Escape from the PS2 sandbox. In Part 1, Escape, the attacker focuses on escaping the sandbox or restricted environment in which the PS2 emulator runs. By doing so, they can gain broader control over the system. This would typically involve crafting specific save files or modifying game data to trigger the buffer overflow and inject the malicious code. Unsigned code execution. Once the sandbox escape is successful, the next goal is to execute unsigned code, which is code not officially authorized by Sony. This is crucial for running homebrew applications, emulators, or potentially even pirated games. Steps in Part 1, Escape. Identify a vulnerable game. Find a PS2 game with a vulnerability that allows data injection or manipulation. Craft malicious save file. Use tools to create a custom save file that exploits the buffer overflow. Load save file on console. Transfer the save file to the console using USB or other means, and load the game to trigger the vulnerability. Execute payload. Once the vulnerability is triggered, a payload malicious code is executed to escape the PS2 emulator's restricted environment. Potential uses. If successful, this could allow homebrew developers to run custom applications, or hackers could exploit the vulnerability for piracy or other malicious activities. Sony typically responds to these vulnerabilities with patches and firmware updates. It's important to note that exploiting such vulnerabilities can void warranties and is often illegal under terms of service agreements. Booting custom PS2 games on a PS4 or PS5 using the Mast 1C0 Re exploit revolves around leveraging the PS2 emulator built into these consoles. Once the exploit is used to gain control of the emulator, it is theoretically possible to boot custom PS2 games, whether homebrew or backups, instead of the official games. Steps for booting custom PS2 games. Prepare the custom PS2 game ISO. You would need a PS2 game in ISO format. This can be either a legally backed up copy of a PS2 game you own or a homebrew game. The file must be compatible with the PS2 emulator on the PS4 or PS5. Trigger the Mast 1C0 Re exploit. Use the Mast 1C0 Re exploit, which involves a buffer overflow vulnerability in a specific PS2 game running on the PS2 emulator of the PS4 and PS5. The exploit allows unsigned code execution, enabling you to bypass the normal limitations of the emulator, which would otherwise prevent you from loading unapproved or custom games. Inject the custom ISO. After successfully triggering the exploit and gaining control of the PS2 emulator, the next step is to load the custom game ISO. This typically involves replacing the legitimate PS2 game's data with your custom game's data in memory, making the emulator think it's running an official game, while it's actually running your custom ISO. Build a custom package, optional. Some developers or hackers choose to build custom packages, PKGs, for the PS4 and PS5. This can be done by converting your custom PS2 ISO into a format that is compatible with the PS2 emulator and then packaging it as a PKG file that can be installed on a jailbroken PS4 or PS5. While MAST1C0 RE doesn't necessarily require a jailbroken console, a custom PKG might be easier to manage once the exploit is initiated. Load the game. With the custom ISO or package ready and the exploit active, the game should now boot via the PS2 emulator, bypassing the usual restrictions. If successful, you'll be playing your custom or homebrew PS2 game on the PS4 or PS5. Challenges. File injection. You need to ensure that the custom game ISO is properly injected into the emulator without triggering crashes. Emulator compatibility. Not all PS2 games run perfectly on the PS4 and PS5 emulator. Custom games may encounter bugs or performance issues depending on how well the emulator can handle them. Firmware patches. Sony often patches vulnerabilities like MAST1C0 RE in system updates, so exploiting the PS2 emulator may only be possible on specific firmware versions. Tools you might need. PS2 ISO. The custom or homebrew PS2 game you want to run. Save file exploit. A crafted save file that triggers the MAST1C0 RE exploit. Payload injector. A way to deliver the payload that runs your custom game ISO. PS2 Classics GUI. Some users use this tool to package PS2 ISOs into PS4 and PS5 compatible PKG files. Risks. Firmware updates. As mentioned, Sony regularly patches exploits. Keeping your system on a specific firmware version may be necessary, but this also means missing out on other system updates and features. Legal implications. Using exploits to run and sign code, especially for pirated games, is illegal and could result in bans or legal action. Bricking. There is always the risk of bricking, rendering your console inoperable when dealing with exploits, though it is rare. In summary, booting custom PS2 games through the MAST1C0 RE exploit involves exploiting the PS2 emulator's vulnerabilities and injecting custom game data into it. While possible, it can be technically challenging and legally questionable depending on your use case. Be patient, developers are just looking for an entry point, not necessarily to play PS2 games. But they have to review what they have. Criticizing when everything is still very green is out of place. Thanks for tuning in to Golden Games. If you found this video helpful, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and share the video. We're almost at 3,000 subscribers, and your support means the world to me. See you in the next one, and take care.